All right, we have this problem where we have an integer array, and we want to return whether the product of the integers is 0, negative, or positive. And if it's negative, we'll return -1, and if it's positive, we'll return 1. So, I mean, the straightforward way that you could solve this if you really wanted to is you could literally multiply all the numbers together, and then test if it's negative or positive or 0. But we want to think about what is the most efficient possible way to solve this problem. So so if you have an array of integers, what information could you possibly use to figure out the sign of the product? So one thing that we can immediately recognize is that if any integer is 0, then the product is 0. And so if we're going to loop through this array, then if we ever run into a 0, we just return 0 and we're done. Okay. So then the only other thing that we could think about is like what information impacts the sign of the product? Assume there's no zeros. What information impacts the sign? All that matters is the number of negative integers, because if you have an even number of negative integers, they will all cancel out and you'll get a positive integer. But if you have an odd number of negative integers, then you'll have pairs cancel out and you'll just be left with a negative. So what we want to do is we want to loop through the array, and if we ever run into a 0, we stop. And we want to keep track of how many negative integers we have, and anytime we see a negative integer, we increase our count by 1. And then we return, at the end, if there's no zeros, we return 1 or -1 based on whether the number of negative integers is even or not. Okay, so let's write this out. I'm writing code because I like it. So we're going to count our negatives. And so it's going to start at 0. So we're going to loop through all the numbers. Okay, so if any number we run into is equal to 0, then the entire product has to be 0, so we just return 0. Otherwise, if x happens to be negative, then we increase the number of negatives by 1. And if x is a positive integer, we don't care, because it will have no impact on the sign. Okay, and then at the very end, if the number of negatives is even, and so how do we test for evenness? So we're going to use division with remainder. So if the remainder when dividing the number of negatives by 2 is 0, that means that negatives is a number which is divisible by 2, which means that it is an even number, which means that we need to return 1 based on the problem statement. Otherwise, it must be the case that there is an odd number of negatives, and so we return -1. All right, and that is what our code is going to look like. So let's go through now and type this up. Negatives equals 0 for x in nums. If x is 0, then we return 0. Otherwise, if x is less than 0, we increment the number of negatives by 1. And at the very end, by the way, so this point, we're only testing for positive or negative because if we get to this point in the code, there hasn't been a 0. If we get to this point in the code, nums cannot contain any zeros, because if it would have contained any zeros, they would have been caught at this point, and we would have exited already. Okay, so if it is the case that negatives is even, meaning that taking the remainder when dividing by 2 is 0, then we return 1. Otherwise, we return -1. Okay, so submit this. And there we go. All right, so again, another quick problem that we're blazing through today, and that's it.